The event was a retirement dinner for a man who had spent 40 years with the same company. A private dining room had been rented for the evening, and the man's colleagues from his office were in attendance. Speeches and toasts were planned, and a gift was to be presented. It was probably like 1,000 other retirement dinners that were being held around the country that night. But this one felt a little different, because the man who was retiring was my father. I flew in for the dinner, but I was really not a part of it. A man's work is quite separate from his family. And the people in the room were as foreign to me as I was to them. To me, most of them were names overheard at the dinner table all my life, as my father sat down to his meal after a day at the office. To them, I was the kid in the framed photograph on my father's desk. Names from a lifetime at the same job. It occurred to me, looking at the men and women in the room, that my father had worked for that same company since the time that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. Looking at the faces of the men and women, I tried to recall the images of each of them that I had built up over the years at our family dinners. My mother was in the room, and my sister and brother. It was virtually the first time in my father's life that there had been any mix at all between his family and his work. The people at his office knew he had a family, and we at home knew he had a job. But that's as close as it ever came. And now we were all together. A man's work, if he's any good at it, is as important to him as his family. Now, that's a fact that the family must, of necessity, ignore. And if the man were ever confronted with it, he would have to deny it. Such a delicate balance, the attention that must be paid to each detail of the job, and then the attention that must be paid to each detail of the family, with never the luxury of an overlap. The speeches began, and as I had expected, much of their content meant nothing to me. They were filled with references and in-jokes about things with which I was not familiar. I saw my father laughing and nodding his head in recognition as each speaker took his turn. And often, the people in the room would roar with glee at something that drew a complete blank with me. And again, it occurred to me, a man spends his life with you, but it's really only half a life. The other half belongs to a world you know nothing about. The speeches were specific and not general. The men and women spoke of little matters that had happened over the course of the years, and each remembrance was like a small gift to my father, sitting and listening. None of us really changed the world in our lifetimes, but we touched the people around us in ways that may last. And that is the real purpose of a retirement dinner like this one, to tell a man that those memories will remain, even though the rules say that he has to go away. I found myself thinking about that, about how my father was going to feel the next morning, knowing that for the first time in his adult life, he wouldn't be driving to the building where the rest of these people would be reporting for work. The separation pains have to be just as strong as the loss of a family member. And yet, in the world of the American workforce, a man is supposed to accept it and even embrace it. I tried not to think about it too hard. When it was my father's turn to speak, his tone of voice had a different sound to me than the one I knew from around the house of my growing up. At first, I thought that it came from the emotion of the evening, but then it struck me that this probably was not true. The voice I was hearing probably was the one he always used at the office, the one I had never heard. I thought about how little I really knew about my father, and I realized that it was not just me. We are a whole nation of sons who think they know their fathers, but who come to understand on a night like this that they are really only half of their fathers' lives. Work is a mysterious thing. Many of us claim to hate it, but it takes a grip on us that is so fierce that it captures emotions and loyalties we never knew were there. The gift was presented, and then, his 40 years of work at an end, my father went back to his home, and I went back to mine.